Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
You know when you're trying to think of a song but just can't quite remember the name? Well, using weed in your teens can make you forget things you want to remember. Want proof? Check out the facts at mindovermarijuana.com. That's mindovermarijuana.com. Sponsored by the California Department of Public Health.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. The recent Israeli airstrike against the T-4 Syrian Air Force base outside of Homs was a sign that Israel is starting to move in a direction that can only mean one thing for the significant Iranian presence in Syria, that they will increasingly become targets for the Israeli Air Force and perhaps in time also for other elements of the Israeli Defense Force. An honourable mention to SIA associate Brett Buckley for passing on to me a News Limited article that showed Israeli images of base locations where Iran and its proxy militias were operating from within Syria. Thanks for that, Brett. Disturbing news to all those who are worried about military escalation and a direct clash between key regional powers in the crowded battlefield that is today's Syria. Clearly, this was intended to show that Israel has Iran covered, and that if Iran decided to retaliate for its losses at T4, there may well be a sustained Israeli air campaign to knock Iran back on its heels. To discuss this and other related issues, we are happy to have back on Strategicon Professor Albert Wolf from the American University, Kabul. Albert is also a regular contributor to the top US political website, The Hill. You may recall that we had Albert on with us around 10 months ago for our episode Postcard from Kabul. Next week, Albert will be joining us for a follow-up to our first look at the beleaguered state of Afghanistan, so stay tuned. We are also joined by SIA's resident existentialist philosopher David Olney. Research assistant Shahrazad Gairat can't be with us in the studio today owing to work commitments, but she has sent in a couple of questions which I will ask on her behalf. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and of course on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Hi Albert, and welcome back to Strategicon.
Thank you for having me, John. It's good to be here.
Albert, in early February, an armed Iranian drone was launched from the Syrian Arab Air Force base T4 outside of the city of Homs, a base long used by the Iranians. As the drone entered the airspace above northern Israel, a patrolling Israeli Apache helicopter shot it down. If left unchecked, do you think that more such probing flights will be launched by Iran from its Syrian bases? And what do you think should be done to stop these aerial provocations?
I think a couple of things. My suspicion is yes, probably. I think that this was, in all probability, was what Thomas Schelling called a salami tactic. That's my best guess. And I think that also the Israeli retaliation, we've talked an awful lot, especially in the past few days about, what should we do or what should have been done about Assad's chemical weapons. The Israeli retaliation after that particular drone came in shows that the West could have done a lot more after any of Assad's usages of chemical weapons. What can be done to stop it? Not a lot. The fact is that it is important to know that there are over 11,000 distinct types of drones. Some have questioned whether even the term drone is useful to describe this technology. At any rate, I think that the only way to get it to stop, I think that it's like any other form of technology. It's almost, it's just, drones can do various things. And part of the reason that states use them, like, let's talk about one of the most famous ones, the Reaper drone the United States uses. We use it, it's low cost, but it has surveillance capabilities and, it can fire missiles. You can't expect fighter pilots to do that because, they said, like they're human beings. They have to sleep, they have to eat, and that sort of thing. Drones like that can, stay in the air for significantly longer periods of time. So I don't think that you're going to be able to completely stop them from using drones unless what Israel does is roll back Iranian influence in Syria. That's what they have to do. And even then, there might be ways for them to launch drones, from say Lebanon, for example, for purposes of surveillance, for instance.
See, that's the very interesting thing about drones. I recently finished reading Brett Velikovic's book about being a drone commander for Delta Force. And what was obvious there was exactly what you said about pilots. Because the drone can be up for a minimum of a 12-hour shift, the humans have to suddenly do the same shift, even if they're knackered. So if you've got a drone stack of 5 Reapers on top of each other to chase targets, it gets progressively more and more chaotic and difficult, and the humans can't keep up. What seems amazing with Israel is that they responded so fast and so effectively. And I think that's the key point for me that came out of what you said. Rather than wait around, ponder or wander, their response was fast and hard. They made the point, if you do this, we will find a way to exact a cost.
This is not something particularly new with Israel, though. I was actually just reading this book last night. Chuck Frelich, who used to be a deputy national security advisor in Israel, just came out with a book about a new, basically a new strategy for Israel. But the point that what they used to call the Ben Gurion doctrine had 3 components. The first was deterrence, the second is early warning, and the third is military decisiveness. Well, after deterrence fails, you need early warning, and then you need to be decisive. And I think that that's exactly what you saw in February. I think it's what we saw again against the T4 site.
Yeah, and like you said, it's nothing new. If we go back to the 1980s, in Lebanon, we're seeing exactly the same thing. That willingness and ability for the machine to work quickly and effectively and execute a plan and exact a usually proportionally higher response than what was done to them.
Right, and the idea is the ultimate idea is to cumulatively rebuild, deterrence. That's the basic idea.
That the stick hits so hard each time that eventually you have to acknowledge that it hurts and it did you harm, because every time there is a heavy duty hit from a baseball bat. Right, exactly.
Albert, research assistant Shahrazad Garad isn't here with us today, unfortunately, but she has sent in a couple of questions. The first of which, is the war in Syria a proxy for a greater conflict between the regional powers in the Middle East and the opposing ideologies of Iran and Israel?
My answer to that is yes, absolutely.
And where do you think this proxy war is going? I mean, we only heard the other night that there were reports coming in from Syria suggesting that there was another Israeli airstrike around the Homs area. Has there been any further confirmation that you know of with regard to those particular strikes? I think the report came from the Jerusalem Post, if my memory serves me correct.
I think it broke up a little bit, but I think you asked me there was a report from the Jerusalem Post.
Yes, correct.
I have not read any formal confirmation. However, what I have read is the defense minister Avigdor Lieberman has basically has said words to the effect that we don't know who did it, but something like this will happen again. As a warning to the Iranians.
With regard to escalation, prior to the Trump-led airstrikes against Syria, there was this constant chatter about how the Americans don't want to escalate a crisis, especially with large powers like Russia and Iran on the ground in Syria as they are, for fear of sparking a broader conflagration. But is a broader conflagration almost inevitable because Israel is a large power? It does have, Syria is north of it. It has, now the country is home to a major Iranian presence, which obviously Israel considers a clear and present danger to its national security. So what are we seeing here? I mean, going back to Shahrazad's question, regarding proxy wars and escalation, obviously at some point Israel has to strike decisively at Iranian power, or else Iranian power simply grows where it is?
Well, I think that I don't think it's inevitable, but I think it's likely that there is some sort of escalation. Now, the question is, what does Russia do and what does Syria do? The point was made a few days ago that, Bashar Assad did not, fight this war. He didn't bring in the Iranians just to become an Iranian or a Russian vassal. And this is, like it or not, this is his country. He does not, I don't think that he really wants to go to war with Israel. He was struck in 2007. He got his nose bloodied in 2006. I don't think that he really wants that. I mean, from everything I understand, there was a piece by David Makovsky about this about 10 years ago. Bashar Assad is actually a pretty risk-averse guy. I mean, this isn't like a Saddam Hussein type who, will just throw caution to the wind and, just roll the dice and, do any odd thing. I think you have to take that into consideration as well, whether or not the Israelis can drive a wedge between Assad and at least the Iranians is an open question. The other thing is that how much the Israelis believe that the Iranians can be deterred. My personal guess is I don't think they put very much faith in their ability to deter Iran necessarily. But how big a conflagration they want is an open question because we know where it starts, we don't know where it ends.
Yeah, I agree with you, Albert, that I really can't see how the Iranians can be dissuaded in that really since 1979 and the revolution, they've been permanently under threat by somebody and paranoia becomes normal. My sort of thing watching from far away, I keep wondering is how is it that the Iranians and Russians can keep working so near each other when in so many ways they see the world differently? That in a sense the Syrians need both sides on their side. And yet the juggling act, it would seem to me, of keeping the Iranians and the Russians on a page where they can both see benefit, work parallel, but not antagonize each other. That seems to me to be the hardest thing probably to achieve for Assad, but also the most likely place that Israel could try and push in a wedge to separate that support for Assad.
That's absolutely true. Now, there was a report, I think yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, in Haaretz, that the Russian foreign minister had said basically that they were considering giving the S-300 missile defense to Syria to prevent further attacks. So that could solve part of that problem.
Yeah, see, the other thing we've been getting reports on now too is just how many ex-Russian special forces fighting as mercenaries have died there in Syria. So in a sense, could Putin privatize a large chunk of the Russian effort there, which might be easier for the Iranians to swallow? So if you sell the missile defense and you make the advisors on the ground contractors, not the state, do you make it possible for Assad to then keep fighting without there being that obvious potential tension between Iran and Russia?
Right. And one other point is, and this is in the FT a couple months ago, one of the main guys financing this is been basically one of the main Russian oligarchs who's very close to Putin. I just wanted to note that.
Albert, with regard to the state of air defense, anytime I get someone on Strategicon, I always like to talk about Russian air defense. The Russians have done a lot in terms of trying to suggest that their air defense technology is number one in the world. You've got the S-400 Triumph, you've got the S-300, you've got the S-1 Pantsir. All these batteries are meant to be able to defend against incoming cruise missiles, incoming fighter planes, incoming anything. Now, if that is actually true, then you would expect that there would be a deterrent effect that Russian air defense systems would have for the forces operating them, whether they be the Iranians, whether they be the Syrians. But arguably Israel, they're like a hot knife through butter when it comes to air defenses in the region generally. Does Israel actually fear these Russian systems? We haven't actually seen them operate in combat yet. I mean, obviously, the Trump-led strike was a way in which we could have seen the effectiveness of a Russian air defense, and certainly it wasn't manifested. So do the Israelis actually fear what the Russians could potentially deploy on the ground in Syria, or is this just part of the game of states?
The honest answer is that I don't know what exactly the Israelis fear. I do think it is definitely part of, as you put it, the game of states. I think it's mainly meant to deter future Israeli attacks. Now, they did say they were doing it around Syrian defenses. They didn't say, the Russians did not say anything about doing it around Iranian ones, although the Russians have in the past sold S-300 and S-400 air defenses to the Iranians. So there's no reason to believe that the Iranians couldn't simply transfer those air defenses, from Iran to Syria, to various sites in Syria.
Yeah, I think we need to remember too that historically, part of the way the Israelis have got past Syrian radar and stuff was literally to hack the radar.
Yeah.
So the radar showed clear scope. So if you've got that ability to do cyber so well, perhaps one thing the Israelis have got in their favour is they're operating in a sphere where they perhaps could go head to head with Russia if they had to, and where the Iranians might be the ones who need to be more careful. So they may have a real advantage that just no one talks about.
That's true. I don't really think that either Russia or Israel wants to get into it with the other party, though.
No, they want to avoid that at all costs. Again, if the Iranians end up in the middle, I don't think anyone cares.
Yeah, I think that the Russians care somewhat. I mean, but I agree. I don't think it's not a relationship of love. And you look at the Iranian press. I mean, the past few weeks, it's been, even by Iranian standards, total paranoia that that Russia is basically taking the bounty of Syria and leaving them out.
Yeah.
So.
And you almost wonder to some extent whether part of the reason for Russian involvement, in Syria and to sort of try and work with the Iranians is to try and balance the fact, if we think about the footage last year when the first, non-stop train from Beijing to Iran, arrived and unloaded huge amounts of Chinese, manufactured goods. In some ways, China in terms of trade is just going to be so important to Iran that if the Russians can't be useful in some other way, they once again find themselves being sort of a second-tier power. They might be able to nuke the world, but they can't be very useful in a day-to-day way. So, the importance of getting Syria right for them, to sort of balance up the books with China in the region is probably going to be very significant in the long run.
And let us not forget, the Chinese are net importers of Russian military technology. They only received their first S-400 regiment the other day, and so therefore they can always on-sell S-400s to the Iranians should they need it.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Actually, Albert, there's one thing that I'm really curious about. When we talk about Russia's involvement in the Middle East, we often forget that in Israel there are a lot of very prominent Russian Jewish people. Now, surely that would actually be a back channel of sorts between Moscow and now Jerusalem in order for the two capitals to coordinate or try to deconflict or try to manage diplomacy better? Because weirdly enough, over the last few months, we haven't seen a very close working relationship between the Russian and the Israeli governments. Can you try to unpack that for us?
That's a question. I don't, part of it, Netanyahu has gone, especially in the past couple of years, to great lengths to try and cultivate Putin. And Putin has, on his side, certainly acted as though he's Israel's friend. Now, a lot of, you listen to sort of, the Fourth Estate in Israel, or a lot of, pundits or, people in think tanks and so forth, they're firmly convinced, Putin is not our friend. But there has been, a warmer relationship between Russia and Israel than there has been in the past, certainly. I can't speak so much to a lot of the Russian or Soviet expat community, although, you take somebody like Avigdor Lieberman, whose party is, a major player in the coalition now. I don't believe, as I said before, I don't believe either party wants to get into it with the other one. I don't know enough, or I can't really speak to whether or not there's anyone who can act as an intermediary, although I'm sure that there are people who could, yeah.
Syria has become the strategic vacuum in which Iran has certainly pressed its advantages, with thousands of Shiite, including Iranian volunteers in Syria, propping up the forces of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, which is also led by a significant Iranian contingent of senior officers. The strategic distance between Iranian forces and Israel has truncated. Albert, can you explain how and why Israel feels threatened by this Iranian presence, when clearly Israel has the best trained, best equipped military force in the Middle East, which is also underpinned by arguably the best economy in the Middle East?
First of all is the fact that there's what we call the loss of strength gradient, which is the further you project force away from your country, the harder it is to project force. And now that, Iraq is just sort of a highway, for lack of a better term, for the Iranians. It's now now Syria, and now you have Iranian troops in Syria. It's much easier for them to project force against Israel. That's the first thing. The second, and being, for lack of a better term, long-term or even enduring rivals, that's an obvious concern for Israel. Now, Israel does have more of a qualitative military advantage than a quantitative one. Part of the thing, though, that people forget is that when Israel mobilizes, when it comes to mobilizing its troops, it keeps its economy, at the forefront of, its mind. Yeah. And so, wants to have not necessarily a short, sharp shock, but it wants its wars to be quick, so as to keep the economic pressure or the economic effect as limited as humanly possible. The longer the conflict, the worse it is for Israel. I don't think that the same is true for Iran, even though war is obviously costly for both sides. So those are the very basic concerns for Israel, is that you now have Iran as a neighbor, as opposed to having this space between them, them in Syria and Iraq. And of course, if you have to mobilize your troops, there is a significant economic cost to that.
I was just thinking about what you were saying and sort of thinking about Australia, that's our problem consistently. What we have is very good and we have very little of it. So, every time we get drawn in, we have to hope it's only in a specialist role that we can do, one specialised unit in rotation for extended periods of time. So we send special forces and we send engineering units where we've got enough to maintain the rotation. And that this is the difference within Iran. And what I was thinking was the comparison. For us, we always think in terms of Indonesia, not that we're ever likely to go to war with them, but that it's a huge archipelago with lots of people and it's used to chaos. And strangely, being used to chaos, it could probably maintain low-level operations long-term far better than we could. And Iran is very much the same from the experience of 1980 to 1988, that ability to sustain low-level or conventional operations for extended periods of time. Is the assumption still that Iran could maintain a multi-year conventional war, or the fact that so much of the population is young, now has education, and is less ideologically committed to the regime? Is Iran also at the point where it needs to think about war differently?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. Remember, everyone in Iran, actually, this is an analogy to Israel. Just as in Israel, men have to do 3 years of service, women have to do 2, unless you're either ultra-Orthodox or you have, a really good excuse, some sort of persistent medical condition. In Iran, all of the men have to do 1 year of service in the military. Plus, they also have the Besiege. It's part of the Pasdaran. Now, do I think they could go on like they did from 1980 to 1988? Possibly, but again, you look at I mean, we always assume that democracies are the only ones that are casualty averse. Autocracies are just as casualty averse, and there are costs to pay on the ground too. I don't think that there will be the same type of suicide squad you guys may remember going back to the earlier days of the Iran-Iraq War. There were suicide squads so as to eliminate the mines that were laid across the Iran-Iraq border. Stuff like that. I mean, there would be tremendous there could be domestic upheaval within Iran too. Their economy has been run into the ground, in my view, unnecessarily. It's not just because of the sanctions. It's because of a host of things. It's because their banking sector doesn't live up to what they call the Basel III rules. They're still on Basel I. It's all sorts of things. They have high transaction costs. It's all sorts of things. So I think that there could be major domestic unrest in the event of a long involved war with Israel, especially if it becomes a war of attrition or a losing war.
Yeah, when we look now that even the Revolutionary Guard are now major players in the economy, and they may still have fervour, but they've also got investments they need to manage. So we've seen such a transition in the nature of who would do the fighting, how the economy can support it, how the revolution perceives it, how the society sees it, that everyone now needs Israel's fast war, and if we're at the level of fast war, then Israel still has its advantage.
That's true. It depends upon what we mean by a fast war. And there would be upheaval in Israel too. They have the same. As I said before, their economy. A lot of the mobilization is based upon economic constraints. But you made a very good point about the Pasdaran. The Pasdaran is believed to be at least the number 3 actor in the Iranian economy. That's something to take into consideration. And traditionally, people don't want to lose. They're not big on losing money on their investments.
And now we'll have our usual musical interlude. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA. And that was Only the Dead Have Seen the End of War by Israeli heavy metal band Orphaned Land from their 2018 album Unsung Prophets and Dead Messiahs. Now we'll return to Strategicon episode 46 featuring Professor Albert Wolff, Israel and Iran, Checkmate in Syria. Albert, with regard to what we've just been talking about, I mean, Russia has significant problems economically. I mean, it's got the economy the size of Spain, and yet it's projecting its power into the Middle East, which is an area that can easily draw in pretty much anyone. And as we've just rightly pointed out, I mean, Iran has also serious economic problems and therefore has clear limits by which it can act militarily. The Iranian currency is under pressure, and while much of the country's economic sanctions were lifted as a consequence of the Iran nuclear deal, a deal reviled by the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as many of the Gulf Arab leaderships, the country's economy is in trouble. So even the Trump administration seems to want to undo the Iran nuclear deal, which, if the pundits are correct, has at least stopped Iranian nuclear developments, a serious piece of diplomacy indeed. Do you think that the Israeli government will coordinate their efforts with Trump to stymie the Iran nuclear deal this year? And if so, what might the ramifications be?
Well, I mean, first I'll admit my own prejudice. I support the Iranian nuclear deal. I personally think it's madness to undo it, and I think that they're opening a Pandora's box, to say the least, by pulling out of it. I mean, there's no evidence to say the least, that the Iranians have violated it of any sort. That said, the Iranian currency, from what I understand, is still the world's most worthless or undervalued currency. I believe it's still that way. Maybe, I think it was in competition with Zimbabwe for some time. But
it took a recent tumble, you'd be surprised to know, Albert. The Iranian currency did.
It's even worse.
It's worse.
The other thing about the Iran deal, I just want to add this, is that domestically it's not as popular as it once was in Iran. And that's because Rouhani really oversold it. I mean, he basically said, he gave people the belief that, this is going to solve all of our problems, when Iran's problems weren't just the nuclear sanctions. I mean, Iran is still heavily sanctioned, and it still has significant domestic economic problems that go beyond sanctions. Do I believe that Netanyahu will work to end this? Yeah, I think absolutely. I believe that he was absolutely sincere when he said that this was, the worst deal since Munich. I think he said that about the JPOA, not JPOA, but there was a biography that came out by Ben Caspit, one of the leading Israeli reporters, about a year ago, that said that he viewed this as one of the major things he had to stop during his time in office, and I think that he would love to undo it. So yes, I think they would be. I think that they would be happy to work with the Trump administration in jettisoning JPOA.
Will it be Jared Kushner who will be acting as Trump's broker in this, you think?
God, I hope not.
Albert, I'm sitting here beside John, and I'm amazed he could ask that with a straight face. To extend that, what I was just thinking as you guys were sort of talking about that stuff is, if the nuclear deal falls over, is this a wonderful opportunity for Russia to go, psst, we can sell you some stuff?
With Russia to what? I'm sorry.
To sell nuclear technology or assisted development to the Iranians if the deal falls over. And suddenly they find they have to be back in the game. They have to be developing nuclear weapons. And they, have to be immune from things like Stuxnet. So, suddenly Russia becomes this potentially very useful player in that it might be able to speed up the process of development for, Iranian nuclear weapons.
And cyber warfare.
Well, I could see Russia maybe selling them, stuff, some of the cyber stuff. And there's still a debate as to how effective things like Stuxnet and the Flame were. Mm-hmm. Whether they actually were to sell them nuclear weapons, I don't know. And the reason is that I don't really think that Russia wants a nuclear Iran.
No.
I don't think that if Russia is serious about reestablishing or establishing a military presence of some sort in the Middle East, a nuclear Iran doesn't do them any good.
No.
Now, I could see them selling them civilian, some certain civilian things, like they help them with Bushehr and so forth. That was the Chinese, but they've helped them with other projects. But helping them acquire a nuclear capacity is not in their interest. I mean, and in a very funny way, the sanctions were actually in Russia's interest because it kept a real competitor out of the world oil markets. I do think it does open up another market, or even further opens up a market for Russia when it comes to selling weapons and so forth. But the other player that hasn't been mentioned is India, which is India opened the port of Chabahar. They certainly pretty savvy when it comes to their own IT industry. I think it could open a further market for them as well. So, but I don't really believe that Russia wants nuclear Iran.
No, it doesn't. It might be able to make a lot of money helping with civilian stuff, helping with cyber, but at the end of the day, Iran not being able to sell oil is just too useful.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I agree with you.
A recent argument in the Lawfare blog argued that Iran has used its position in Syria to gain training and experience for its armed forces and those volunteers which have acted on their behalf. Iran has effectively created a model for asymmetric land war in the Middle East by which it can stretch and sustain Iranian power into the Levant without breaking the state it serves. If this is true, does it mean that Iran's conventional asymmetric military threat is of far greater utility to it than any nuclear threat ever was?
That's a really good question. I really don't know how to answer. I mean, it depends upon... There is a debate upon how you can see nuclear weapons. Because, I mean, there was a terrific book that just came out by Matt Furman and Todd Sexter that basically said nuclear weapons aren't very good for coercive diplomacy. Now, you could say they overstated the case. But when it comes to, completing these sort of asymmetric, operations, nuclear weapons obviously aren't very useful. So the answer would be, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, that would be true. I do think that a nuclear Iran still would be, in the greater strategic scheme of things, would be a much greater threat. But I do think that whoever wrote, I'm not familiar with this blog post. That this could prove to be a tremendous boon to Iran.
The recent US-led coalition bombing of 3 Syrian chemical warfare sites has had its fair share of international criticism for a whole host of reasons. But one criticism that seemed muted is that had the airstrikes been bigger in scale and of longer duration, for example like 1998's Operation Desert Fox over Iraq, it might well have decisively changed the nature of the Syrian civil war and altered the internal balance of power, possibly bringing the civil war to an end. Obviously, a larger Western air campaign could have also provided sufficient air cover for Israeli forces to roll back Iranian power in Syria. Has there been any public thinking on this in Israel, that the Friday the 13th strikes were an opportunity lost?
I haven't heard that specific criticism, but what I do think is that I think that the Israelis were greatly disappointed that there hasn't been a follow-up or that there weren't more strikes. And that, after the strikes, Trump, reiterated, as you've heard, that we're pulling out of Syria. That this was, despite, Trump's bravado and the mission accomplished thing, we're done. And I agree completely with the idea that, this could have been bigger and, better in the sense that, this could have really decimated or done much greater harm to Bashar Assad's ability to engage in chemical warfare. I don't agree with the idea that this would end the civil war because even with Assad gone, there are still many factions, the remnants of his state, the Kurds, other ethnic groups that would still be vying for power and influence, plus other players, including the Turks, which we really haven't talked about, plus, the Iranians, the Russians, and so forth. So I don't think the civil war would be at an end. I do think that it would have given the Israelis a window of opportunity.
With regard to that, of course, the civil war may not have come to an end, but the internal dynamics of the civil war would have changed fundamentally if that strike would have been sustained for a period of 4 to 6 days. Would you not think?
I think so, especially if, let's say, hypothetically, Bashar Assad was killed, for example.
Yeah.
I think it would have been, or you saw not just Bashar. Let's say this is a counterfactual, but let's say Assad and the Assad family were killed. I think that certainly would have changed the dynamics.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really have to wonder if part of the reason for leaving it at a single day is they really did take the risk into calculation of what if we end up hitting some Russians the more we extend it, or what if we hit some Syrians, some important Iranian officers, that the risk of extending beyond the basic attack was just too high.
I don't know about the Israelis certainly didn't seem too risk averse about hitting Iranian officers. I don't know the risk calculation with the U.S. I do think there was a risk calculation about hitting Russians. I think that would probably be the biggest risk calculation involved.
Albert, since the Erdogan coup in Turkey, Turkey has been, well, not really a force for good. It's been a force for, I suppose, a redevelopment of Turkish religious sensibilities as well as power sensibilities. How is Israel actually coping with this new Turkey that it sees before it? I mean, there was a time where Erdogan and the Israeli government were almost, dare I say, in cahoots. I mean, in terms of being the balancers in the Middle East that would try to bring as much stability for their own common interests and good. And now we see Ankara and Jerusalem literally split asunder. How do you think this is going to play out as the months roll on in the Syrian battle space?
Well, I mean, this unfortunately, this isn't new. I mean, we go back to you go back a few years over the Turkish attempt in Gaza to help. I forget the name of the ship, but the Israelis actually handled the public diplomacy of it quite well. But that was the first real public kind of a falling out. I mean, and before Erdogan was in, I mean, Turkey and Israel had a very good relationship. My hope is that actually what you could see is another potential wedge, that could be exploited between Turkey and Iran. I mean, now it comes at the expense of the Kurds, but there's been talk that, well, maybe Turkey won't leave the areas in Iran that it's captured, like around Manbij and areas like that, and that could prevent this long feared establishment of an Iranian land bridge, and that's something that both Turkey and Israel agree on. So I think that could be one area of cooperation between them, and the other is obviously the exploitation of natural gas in the Mediterranean.
Well, if we add the extra complicating layer of Russia on top of this, we only saw recently that there was a summit between Rouhani, Putin, and Erdogan. How does Russia think that it can manage two Middle Eastern regional powers, namely Turkey and Iran, that are more divergent than convergent? How do you think that Russia will be able to manage the expectations of these two regional powers? I mean, they can sell weapons to them, they can allow them to, do certain things in specific areas of Syria, but apart from that, the historical default setting is that Turkey and Iran have been enemies, as have the Russians and the Turks. So how does all this work out?
That's a terrific question because, I mean, you may remember before the Kurdish referendum in the fall, I mean, you saw very high-level meetings taking place between Ankara and Tehran, but that was about it. I mean, that was about all they had in common together. I mean, they've been on opposite sides in this thing in Syria for some time now. They really do have opposite interests in the Caucasus too, even though it's a little outside of our conversation. My only guess is that, in addition to selling weapons, is that Russia can, just force them to get along in these other regions like the Caucasus, which are both of interest to Russia, Turkey, and Iran. But I mean, you're absolutely right. They do have divergent interests, and I think that managing that, especially in a place like Syria, is going to be extraordinarily tricky. I don't know how they pull it off. I don't know how. I don't know what levers or what instruments Putin has at his disposal to exactly bring that about.
I'm wondering if perhaps the only card Putin has for this is that the Russians have the experience with natural gas to perhaps be the people who exploit the Leviathan gas field on behalf of all these other countries who have access to the field, but who would potentially end up at war with each other of crossing into each other's territory. That perhaps Russia gets to be the middleman for exploitation and divvying up the money between everyone, because I can say, well, look, none of you drill it, we'll drill it. And at least therefore you're not crossing into each other's territory. So whether it's pure economic necessity might be the biggest advantage the Russians have.
That's true. That's a good point, yeah.
Okay, finally, Shahrazad asks, there are multiple stakeholders in the Syrian conflict, each with their own agenda. What can you see as the next course of action should a major conflict break out in the region, and what are the potential impacts on the rest of the world? What would you consider the red line to be?
When she says another major conflict outside of Syria?
A course of action in Syria. I mean, what would be the thing that would actually make a much broader conflict in Syria?
The most likely thing I would see happening is an Iranian retaliation. I mean, the Iranians have promised a retaliation, not just for the U.S. attack, but for the Israeli attack. Now, there was a statement from the number 2 guy in Hezbollah who said there won't be a major war unless the U.S. and Israelis go nuts. However that is defined, but I do think that there will be some. I can't see the Iranians not retaliating in some way. I think it depends upon the degree of retaliation and whether this is just a tit-for-tat retaliation and it's something small, or whether it goes up to the level of, let's say, what we saw in 2006 in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Remains to be seen.
Well, actually, Hezbollah is one of the players that we haven't actually focused on this. There are reportedly about 8,000 fighters, Hezbollah fighters, in Syria. Now, they're getting all very battle-hardened and all that kind of stuff. But Hezbollah is both a political and a military organization in Lebanon. They have to measure their resources out on a very careful basis. Do you think that Hezbollah has the capacity to launch any kind of attack against Israel, considering their already heavy investment in Syria?
Without having, the tools of it, without having, all these are estimates, so we don't exactly know how many they still have in Lebanon. And some of the fighters they believe have been recruited from Syria. Do I think they have the ability to launch an attack from Lebanon? Yes, because they have it's believed that they have a pretty significant rocket force. But I think that your question at least implies that they could, what was I going to say? What would be the next stage? That I can't answer. I mean, I remember after the 2006 war, Nasrallah said that, if I had known what the retaliation was going to be, we wouldn't have started this. It was something to that effect.
Yeah.
The honest answer is that I don't know. I mean, I do think that they can certainly act as a strong deterrent to Israel. I think that they could certainly launch a few missiles at Tel Aviv or something like that. I don't know if it'll be on the same scale as 2006, though.
See, I really wonder at the moment if their focus has far more moved towards they were very effectively being the state within the state in Lebanon, and now they're being the state within the state within the state, providing genuinely meaningful services for Syrian refugees, that at the moment they're gaining so much street cred, so many people now owe them, putting that at risk for a strike at Israel where they can't have a good second punch seems silly when their gains are so big.
Right. No, that's a good point, and I mean, Hezbollah is certainly not stupid. I don't know what the second punch would look like. I would imagine it might be more rocket attacks, but I don't think at this stage it would be on a scale of 2006.
No, they learnt the lesson there that they did probably better than they should have, and the Israelis found it a harder battle than they thought it should be. But what it really taught everyone is the rules of the 80s and 90s are over. The game has changed, and better to play the state within the state game in Lebanon and gain support and subvert Lebanon and deal with Israel later once you control the entire state.
Right. No, it's a good point.
Okay, Albert, well, I think that brings this episode to a close, so I thank you very much for your insights, and we hope that we'll be able to hear from you again soon on Strategicon.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure being with you.
Thanks,
bye-bye.
Albert.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.